A beloved dog left alone in an empty apartment. A cat with no food or water. Men simply gone. No struggle, no note, no trace. For years, police called it coincidence. They were wrong, and the man responsible had been standing in plain sight the whole time, dressed as Santa Claus at the local mall. Before we dig into this one, hit subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories, and it costs you nothing but a second. All right, let's get into it. Between 2014 and 2018, the Toronto Police Service received more than 4,000 missing persons reports each year. At the time, most of these cases were straightforward and resolved within days. But while those reports moved through the system, the 51st Division, known in Toronto for policing the Church Wellesley neighborhood, home to the city's gay community, logged roughly 600 missing persons cases during that same stretch of time. Officers handling these investigations generally prioritized cases involving women or young people, pushing cases involving adult men further down the list. Part of this came from sheer volume. Investigators simply assumed grown men were capable of looking after themselves. But the situation ran deeper than that. At the time, the force was dealing with an internal crisis of its own, marked by an unusual wave of early retirements tied to health issues. Officers were exhausted, stretched thin, buckling under stress, and it was in this strained environment that a string of disappearances began quietly catching the department's attention, though no one yet realized they were on the verge of confronting one of the largest cases in the city's history. Of course, at that point, they had no idea what was coming. So, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Brian Emmendorfer, and welcome back to another episode of Bone Collector. Today, we're exploring a string of disappearances that led to the creation of two separate task forces, which, after nearly a decade of investigation, discovered they were hunting the same man, a man who seemed simple, friendly, well-liked in his community, who occasionally dressed as Santa Claus at the local mall, but who hid, behind that gentle face, a cruelty worthy of the worst kind of serial killer. In September 2010, Toronto police received a missing persons report for a 40-year-old man named Skandaraj Navaratnam. According to his friends, Skandaraj had simply vanished, without leaving any trace of where he might have gone, something they considered completely out of character. The situation grew even stranger when friends discovered his beloved dog left alone in his apartment, something he would never have done voluntarily. As police investigated, they found no signs of a planned departure, nothing suggesting he'd simply left on his own. During the investigation, it was revealed that Skandaraj had been born in Sri Lanka, and for a while, investigators floated the theory that he might have quietly returned to his home country without telling anyone. But the circumstances surrounding his disappearance left too many open questions. Friends described him as sociable, well-read, and passionate about crossword puzzles. As the investigation progressed, police discovered that much of Skandaraj's social life centered around Church Wellesley, commonly known as the Gay Village, where he was a regular. Many people there knew him well, and they firmly rejected the idea that he'd simply left the area. Joey Becker, a bartender at Zippers, one of Skandaraj's favorite bars, told the Toronto Star that he was the kind of person who could light up a room, adding that it was impossible not to smile around him. At the time, local press gave the case wide coverage, but as the weeks dragged on, it became clear police weren't making progress. 2 months passed until, on December 29, 2010, Peel Regional Police received a new missing persons report, this time for Abdulbasir Faizi, 42-year-old print shop assistant. His wife filed the report, saying he'd never come home from work. At the time, Abdulbasir was married with 2 children, living with his family in Brampton, a Toronto suburb. During the investigation, police learned Abdulbasir had last been seen leaving the print shop where he worked in the Mississauga area. The search for his whereabouts led to the discovery of his car, a 2002 Nissan Sentra, abandoned on Moore Avenue near Milkman's Lane Park in Toronto. The abandoned state of the vehicle deepened the mystery surrounding the case. Forensic examiners went over the car in detail, but found nothing that pointed to a crime. Even so, given the overall circumstances, the most plausible theory remained that something criminal had occurred. That theory grew stronger when investigators discovered Abdul Basir had been living a double life, hidden from his wife. The investigation revealed he was an active member of Toronto's gay community, frequently spending time in the gay village. Among his favorite bars was Zippers, where new witnesses confirmed seeing him after work hours, meaning that instead of heading home, he was making secret visits to the neighborhood. Friends described him as sociable and outgoing, but someone who lived with real anxiety as a refugee from Sri Lanka. A key witness, Dax Dubois, a close friend of Abdul Basir's, revealed that in the gay village, people generally avoided discussing their families, which meant no one there knew he was married or living a double life. While the revelation didn't shock those close to him within the community, it devastated his wife, who only learned the truth after his disappearance. By this point, Toronto authorities and the press had already noticed the similarities between the two disappearances. Gay men of South Asian descent, living double lives within the community. Suspicion began to grow that something more sinister might be at play. Still, police departments stayed quiet as they deepened their investigation. Then, just over 2 years later, on October 25, 2012, Toronto's disappearances returned to the headlines. That day, the eldest son of Majid Kayhan, a 58-year-old Afghan immigrant, reported his father missing after noticing his absence. According to the son, he'd last seen his father at a family gathering a week earlier. A friend of Majid's confirmed seeing him last on that same occasion. Early in the investigation, police discovered that Majid, too, had been living a double life. He was quite active in the gay village, frequenting local bars and cafes, and had maintained a secret relationship with another man who had died before his own disappearance. Throughout that relationship, Majid had kept an apartment in the neighborhood that he'd used for casual encounters for decades. Unlike the earlier victims, Majid wasn't described as a man of good reputation. Quite the opposite, according to those close to him. He reportedly struggled with serious substance dependency, which often led to violent behavior, particularly at home. Given Majid's profile, it didn't take long before authorities faced questions about whether his case might connect to the earlier disappearances. At first, police avoided commenting, until an alleged case of cannibalism shocked the province. A user going by ChefMate50 on an online cannibalism forum called Zombie and Meat claimed to have killed and eaten a man in Toronto. The claim triggered a deeper investigation and led to the formation of a dedicated task force. Toronto police announced the creation of a unit called Project Houston. The team dove into the dark, distorted world of the Zambian Meat website and similar forums. The user behind the claims was quickly identified as James Alex Brunton, a retiree living in the Peterborough area of Ontario. James was placed under round-the-clock surveillance, while a large-scale operation gathered intelligence on him. Before long, though, investigators concluded James hadn't killed anyone. His claims were nothing more than distorted fantasy. It also became clear he had no connection whatsoever to Toronto's ongoing disappearances. James was described using the forensic psychiatry term, howler, someone who pretends to be dangerous or predatory, but poses no real threat at all. After ruling him out, the task force redirected its focus to Skandaraj Navaratnam's case, missing since September 2010. Investigators believed the case might connect to the world of online erotic fantasy, a line of thinking that led the task force to reach out to none other than the infamous Luca Magnotta, recently convicted at the time for the brutal murder of student Jun Lin, a crime he'd filmed and posted online. Though suspicion briefly fell on Magnotta as a possible link to Skandaraj's disappearance, no evidence ever tied the two together. In the years that followed, the task force compiled every missing men's case with similar profiles, trying to establish a connection between them. But the investigation produced no concrete answers. The only conclusions they could draw were that all the victims were foreign-born men, regulars in the gay village, who had possibly gotten involved with individuals whose sexual fantasies fell outside the ordinary. It was April 2017 when the disappearance of 44-year-old Turkish immigrant Selim Esen was reported by his best friend. According to him, the two spoke daily, until Selim suddenly stopped responding to messages. Worried, his friend went to check on him and found the apartment completely abandoned, prompting a call to police. Digging into Selim's background, investigators learned he'd arrived in Canada in 2013 and quickly became involved with the LGBT community in the gay village. His siblings described him as friendly, kind, independent, and passionate about gardening. In the past, Selim had struggled with and overcome substance addiction, and, after his own recovery, he'd gone on to help others through theirs. Investigators interviewed numerous people from his circle, but no one seemed to have any relevant information. His disappearance carried no obvious motive, aside from the possibility that something external had happened to him. The case was quickly linked to the earlier disappearances, deepening suspicion of a real connection between them. 2 months later, on June 28, 2017, Toronto police received another missing persons report, this time for 49-year-old Andrew Kinsman. A group of his friends went to check on his apartment and found nothing that seemed suspicious at first glance. But something did stand out. His elderly cat had been left alone, with no food or water. Investigators dug for witnesses, for any reason that might explain his sudden absence, but came up empty. People close to him described Andrew as very active on social media. Still, when police tried tracking his cell phone, they found it was switched off. As Andrew's family and friends were interviewed, it became clear he wasn't the type of person to take off on a long trip without telling anyone, let alone without arranging care for his aging cat. One detail stood out even more. Andrew had vanished on the very same day he'd attended Toronto's Pride Parade. Given these circumstances, his case was added to the growing list of missing men connected, in one way or another, to the gay village. In response, a new task force was formed, Project Prism, tasked with investigating the disappearances of Andrew Kinsman and Selim Esen. Alongside this, the earlier files from Project Houston were pulled and re-examined for possible connections. From this point on, the theory that a serial killer was operating in Toronto began gaining real traction. On August 1, 2017, Greg Downer, a longtime friend of Andrew Kinsman, organized a community safety meeting focused on the gay village. Representatives from the task force attended, offering an overview of the city's ongoing investigations. During the discussion, it came out that the investigation had been slowed by legal hurdles. Canadian authorities faced real limitations accessing the dating app accounts of missing men, since the servers hosting that data sat outside the country. Faced with this obstacle, Greg appealed directly to dating app developers, asking them to build a feature letting users pre-authorize quick data sharing with police in case they went missing. He also pushed to establish dedicated tip lines to encourage witnesses to come forward. The goal was to reach men living double lives in the gay village, who might otherwise avoid police out of fear of being outed. With anonymous tip lines in place, these individuals could share information in complete confidence. Toronto's LGBT community, now fully mobilized, responded forcefully to the growing threat of a possible predator, even as authorities stepped up their own precautions. But a disturbing murder would soon raise the tension even further. On November 29, 2017, the body of 22-year-old Tess Richardson was found by her own mother in an alley near an exterior stairwell. Tess had been missing for 4 days, and her death was quickly linked to the search for Toronto's suspected serial killer. Her body was the first discovered under circumstances that initially seemed to match the pattern of the missing men's cases, prompting investigators to explore a possible connection to the task force's ongoing work. But the differences soon became clear. Tess was Canadian-born, and her only real connection to the gay village came through her job at a downtown cafe. She'd occasionally attend parties and bars in the area, but nothing beyond what would be typical for someone her age. She was last seen alive on Friday, November 24th, 2017, after spending a few hours at her sister Rachel's house. She left around 11:30 that night, heading toward the gay village with a friend from her school days she hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Their first stop was Cruise and Tangos, a drag bar popular with students and young people in the area. The two stayed until around 1:30 in the morning, then decided to explore another part of the neighborhood. There, they found a hot dog cart at a busy intersection and struck up conversations with several people, including an unidentified man. Around 4 a.m., Tess's friend received a message from her boyfriend asking her to come home, but Tess apparently decided to stay behind. The next morning, her friend tried reaching out, only to notice her messages weren't going through. After the missing persons report was filed, police discovered Tess had requested an Uber at 4 a.m., but the ride was canceled for unknown reasons. Her whereabouts remained a mystery until November 27th, when her mother found her body in an alley near where she'd last been seen, beside a boarded-up house under renovation. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as manual strangulation, confirming it as a homicide. In early December, security footage surfaced showing Tess walking alongside a man just minutes after she'd been left alone. According to her friend, the man matched the description of someone she'd seen near the hot dog cart that night. Later recordings showed Tess and the suspect entering the very alley where her body would later be found. The same footage showed the man leaving the scene alone just minutes later. As the hunt for Tess, Richardson's killer, intensified, another homicide was recorded in the ravines of Toronto's Rosedale neighborhood. The victim was identified as Allura Wells, a 27-year-old transgender woman experiencing homelessness. Notably, her body had actually been discovered some time earlier, but the case had been treated as low priority, a consequence of the task force's overwhelming workload on Project Prism, compounded by the intense focus on Tess Richardson's murder, which was consuming most of the authorities' attention. This oversight sparked outrage within Toronto's transgender community, who criticized the lack of priority given to the case as a direct result of the victim's marginalized status. Toronto police initially stayed silent in the face of these accusations, but eventually held a press conference. There, Police Chief Mark Saunders stated that the 3 investigations, Project Prism, Tess Richardson's homicide, and Allura Wells's mysterious death, were separate cases, with no connection between them. He also said there was no evidence a serial killer was active in the city, a claim that drew widespread criticism. After all, the missing men shared such a similar profile that no other explanation seemed plausible, beyond the possibility they were victims of the same unknown individual. Still, the police's denial was widely seen as an attempt to downplay the community's growing fear. But the course of the investigation would soon change dramatically, thanks to one strange and unsettling event, the beginning of the breakthrough that would finally expose the man behind Toronto's missing men. Project Prism became one of the strongest examples of data analysis driving public safety work in Toronto's history. Its efficiency stood out almost immediately. Beyond the investigators' groundwork, the project relied on an innovative method for organizing and analyzing massive volumes of data, which helped surface patterns across the cases under review. The supervision of Detective Sergeant Michael Whitman and led by Detective Sergeant Hank Idsinga, important patterns began to emerge. Every victim identified so far was a middle-aged, bearded man who frequented one specific bar, the Black Eagle. Investigators also noted that the victims were known within the gay community as bears, a term of self-identification used by openly gay men with markedly masculine physical traits. As for the predator's method, investigators identified that he tended to strike on weekends and holidays. Skandaraj disappeared on Labor Day, Abdul Basir right after Christmas, Majid on Thanksgiving, Salim around Easter, and Andrew disappeared during Toronto's Pride weekend. Beyond that, several of the victims came from South Asian or Middle Eastern backgrounds, making them more likely to live in transient housing and to keep their involvement in the gay community private. These factors may well have contributed to why they became targets. Sergeant Hanke Idsinga was appointed lead investigator. He had a solid track record with at least 13 years of experience in Toronto's homicide unit. Experienced as he was, though, Hank had never handled a serial killer case before, and the expectations riding on his work were enormous. To strengthen the effort, the task force was reinforced with 6 additional officers from the 51st Division, responsible for policing downtown Toronto, including both residential and commercial neighborhoods like the Gay Village. At the time, the 51st Division was widely respected across the city for its active role in community events and its collaboration with local organizations on public safety and building trust. Among the 6 officers assigned to Project Prism, at least 3 had previously worked on Project Houston and were already familiar with the details of the earlier investigation. An officer from the Sex Crimes Unit was also brought in to add a broader perspective to the task force's strategy. It quickly became clear that the victims had been in contact with numerous unfamiliar men, significantly widening the pool of possible suspects, largely because all of them used dating apps, a common tool within the community under investigation. Despite the difficulty, the investigation had to follow that thread, and every one of these men was added to the suspect list. Most were cleared as the inquiry progressed, but one name in particular caught investigators' attention. While reviewing Andrew Kinsman's final days, officers noticed his apartment calendar had a single word written on it: Bruce, marked on the exact day he disappeared. Security footage also showed a man approaching Andrew's building in a red vehicle that same day, but the task force struggled to make out the license plate or exact model of the car due to poor image quality. To make matters worse, the footage wasn't clear enough to identify the driver. Even so, detailed analysis of the footage revealed the vehicle had chrome trim, which helped narrow the model down to a 2004 Dodge Caravan. Toronto had roughly 6,000 similar vehicles registered at the time, but only 5 of those were tied to owners named Bruce. And luckily, only one matched a 2004 Dodge Caravan. That vehicle belonged to a seemingly gentle gardener named Bruce MacArthur, just past 60 years old. When identified, Bruce didn't match the profile investigators had expected. His Facebook page showed ordinary photos for a man his age, projecting a peaceful, friendly image that seemed far removed from suspicion. Still, the task force tried to track down his van, but by then, he no longer owned it. As the investigation advanced, judicial warrants were issued, granting authorities full access to Bruce's data across platforms including Google, Rogers Wireless, Bell Canada, TELUS, the Royal Bank of Canada, and Manulife Bank. In the months that followed, new warrants were secured to trace vehicle and phone records tied to Bruce MacArthur, and slowly, the net around their prime suspect began to close. Through the growing pool of collected data, the task force obtained additional warrants granting access to Bruce's information on Yahoo, Air Canada, and other databases, along with records tied to his involvement with the LGBT publisher Pink Triangle Press. Piecing this information together, investigators traced his activity to the town of Courtice, Ontario. There, they discovered Bruce had recently sold his van to a garage called Don's Auto Repair. When the owner, Dominic Viter, was questioned, he confirmed the purchase, and to his horror, he and his staff later found what appeared to be bloodstains inside the vehicle. The van remained exactly as Bruce had left it and was immediately sent for forensic analysis. Security footage also captured Bruce MacArthur at the garage, negotiating the sale of the van. Following these leads, the task force learned Bruce had a long-standing arrangement with the owner of a property on Mallory Crescent in Toronto's Leaside neighborhood. He provided landscaping services in exchange for storage space in the client's shed. Armed with a search warrant, a police team accompanied by cadaver dogs revisited the property's backyard, hoping to locate human remains. A surveillance camera was also installed on site for continuous monitoring. But despite the thorough search, the dogs gave no indication of bodies buried there. Meanwhile, the task force managed to reconstruct a complete timeline of Bruce's movements on the day Andrew Kinsman disappeared. At the same time, Toronto's forensic lab analyzed the bloodstains found in the van and matched the DNA to both Andrew Kinsman and Salim Essen. That positive match was enough to secure a search warrant for Bruce's residence. On December 4, 2017, a police team quietly entered Bruce McArthur's apartment and cloned his computer's hard drive. They found nothing suspicious in the files at that time. 4 days later, at a press conference, authorities announced that more than 62 witnesses had been questioned. The investigation had also secured 28 judicial authorizations and assigned 308 investigative actions, of which 225 had already been completed. Despite the relentless effort and the DNA match, authorities still lacked concrete proof tying the disappearances together. A statement made because, at the time of the announcement, the analysis of Bruce's hard drive was still ongoing. But in January 2018, the task force resumed its work at full force after specialists managed to recover deleted files and stored records from the device. Among the recovered items were photographs of the bodies of Salim Essen and Andrew Kinsman. With this discovery, Bruce McArthur was placed under round-the-clock surveillance, while preparations for his arrest moved forward. Officers, however, had strict orders not to make the arrest unless he was seen alone with another man. To everyone's shock, on January 18th, Bruce was spotted entering his apartment with a young man, later identified as John. Officers immediately moved to breach the residence. The entry took several minutes, and when they finally got inside, they found John bound to Bruce's bed, a black bag over his head, handcuffed. Bruce McArthur was arrested on the spot. In his statement, John said he'd consented to being handcuffed and revealed he'd met Bruce through the dating app Grindr, having met with him on previous occasions as well. Even so, officers believed that particular encounter could easily have ended in death, and that they'd arrived just in time to save the young man's life. After his arrest, Bruce McArthur was taken in for questioning. A range of items were seized from his apartment, including 5 cell phones, 5 computers, 3 digital cameras, and roughly a dozen USB flash drives. Subsequent analysis of these devices revealed further evidence tied to the murders of Andrew Kinsman and Salim Essen. At the first press conference following the arrest, Sergeant Hank Idsinga said that while the task force didn't yet know the exact location of the bodies, they had a strong idea of where to begin searching. He also stressed that the evidence collected was already strong enough to secure a conviction, even without recovering the victims' remains. This breakthrough connected Bruce McArthur directly to the long list of missing men originally investigated under Project Houston and later under Project Prism. Idsinga was convinced of Bruce's guilt, but he knew it would be crucial to speak with him directly and dig deeper into his movements during the periods when each disappearance occurred. This line of investigation would soon lead to a series of discoveries that would establish Bruce McArthur as the man behind one of the largest serial murder investigations in modern Canadian history. In late February 2018, the Ontario Provincial Police, the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service, and the Centre of Forensic Sciences joined forces with the investigation. The goal was to help locate bodies and explore cold or unidentified cases involving victims matching the same profile. More than 100 cases were reviewed in coordination with other Canadian and international police forces. Meanwhile, Bruce McArthur was undergoing questioning, and investigators began digging into his past to build a fuller picture of the man behind the killings. Bruce McArthur spent most of his early life in Argyll, a rural area in the Kawartha Lakes region, where he grew up on a farm. His mother was an Irish Catholic woman, while his father was a Scottish Presbyterian. Both were deeply devout, but their differing views on Scripture often sparked heated arguments at home. Bruce grew up with one biological sister, though his parents, known for their generosity, regularly took in troubled children from the area. At times, more than 6 children lived on the farm at once. The community saw them as a model family, deeply committed to helping those in need. Though tensions inside the house were constant, Bruce often sided with his mother during family conflicts, which led his father to suspect early on that his son might be gay, a suspicion reinforced by traits considered more feminine in personality. Bruce, for his part, knew he was different from a young age, particularly regarding his sexuality, but the prevailing prejudice in the area pushed him to bury those feelings and desires. As a result, he struggled to form friendships at school and to build relationships with women. Eventually, his parents transferred him to a different school, where Bruce met Janice Campbell, who would become his first girlfriend. In 1970, Bruce and Janice graduated together and continued their relationship. Shortly after, Bruce began a general business program, and 2 years later, married Janice. The couple moved to Toronto, where Bruce landed a job as a purchasing assistant at a department store. He held that position for 5 years before moving on to sales work at McGregor's Socks. In this new role, he traveled to department stores, building partnerships to get the company's products onto shelves. Some time later, Bruce switched jobs again, taking a merchandising position with Stanfield's, a clothing company. During this period, his father was diagnosed with a brain tumor and admitted to a care home. Bruce assumed his mother would take on his father's care, but to his surprise, she, instead, began a relationship with another man. Her decision left Bruce angry and frustrated, pushing him to grow closer to his father instead. In 1978, his mother died suddenly of cancer. The following year, Bruce and Janice moved to Oshawa, where they had 2 children, Melanie and Todd. 2 years later, in 1980, his father passed away as well. In the years that followed, Bruce led a quiet family life and became active in his local church. He would later admit this involvement was, in part, an attempt to occupy his mind and suppress the homosexual feelings that had been a constant inner struggle since youth. By the early 1990s, though, Bruce finally gave in and began secretly seeing other men. The secret didn't last long. Within a year, he decided to tell Janice, who chose to stay with him despite the revelation. Sometime later, the family faced a serious crisis when Todd, Bruce's son, was charged with making obscene phone calls to several women. The legal proceedings took a significant financial toll, forcing Bruce and Janice to spend a considerable sum on his defense. Then, in mid-1993, the family's finances worsened further when Bruce lost his sales job. Despite the hardship, they managed to hold things together until 1997, when they had to mortgage their home. That same year, Bruce and Janice decided to separate. After the divorce, Bruce moved to Toronto alone and began frequenting the gay village, regularly visiting the neighborhood's bars. He got his own apartment and eventually entered a relationship with a man that lasted around 4 years. In the early 2000s, Bruce began seeing a psychiatrist who prescribed Prozac to help manage his mental health. To make a living, he decided to strike out on his own as a landscaper, founding his own company, Artistic Designs. For years, Bruce MacArthur's life seemed relatively ordinary. Then, on October 31st, 2001, Bruce's first known run-in with the law took place. That night, he met a man named Mark Henderson. At some point, Mark invited Bruce back to his apartment to show off his Halloween costume. Once there, without warning, Bruce attacked him, striking his head repeatedly with an iron pipe. Mark tried to fight back, but was overpowered and lost consciousness. When he came to, he managed to call for an ambulance and was taken to hospital. His injuries included several deep cuts to the back of his head and his fingers, requiring stitches and weeks of physical therapy. Police searched for Bruce, but he turned himself in before they found him, claiming he couldn't remember what had happened. During proceedings, Bruce pleaded guilty to the charges. His defense argued that his violent behavior may have been influenced by a combination of medications, including an anticonvulsant and amyl nitrite, a substance often used recreationally before sex. Bruce was initially sentenced to 2 years in prison, but after psychiatric evaluations, the sentence was reduced. The judge concluded Bruce didn't pose a high risk of reoffending. Mark Henderson, meanwhile, was left deeply traumatized by the attack, though the fact that he never provided a victim impact statement contributed to the lighter sentence Bruce ultimately received. Bruce served his first year under house arrest, during which he was barred from entering the gay village and from going anywhere near Mark's home or workplace. The court also banned him from owning firearms for 10 years and from using drugs without a prescription, including amyl nitrite. His DNA was collected and entered into a criminal database. As part of his sentence, Bruce was ordered to attend psychotherapy and psychiatric follow-up care. Even so, despite the various restrictions imposed on him, Canadian authorities at the time didn't actively monitor offenders once released. In practice, this meant Bruce would only face consequences again if he drew police attention on his own. He, for his part, took great care to avoid any behavior that might raise suspicion. Bruce MacArthur then registered on a gay BDSM dating site called Recon, where he sought out submissive men. He also created profiles on at least 9 other dating platforms. During this period, it appeared Bruce limited himself to consensual encounters with these men. That continued until 2010, when, under Toronto Police's data retention policy, his criminal record was destroyed. The only surviving documents were his written confession, a handful of reports, and photographs of Mark Henderson's injuries, along with the iron pipe used in the attack. The following year, Bruce created a Facebook account and began connecting with men of South Asian or Middle Eastern descent, who frequently appeared in his photos. By this point, Bruce was already a familiar face in the gay community, particularly among regulars of the gay village, but his reputation was far from spotless. The 2001 incident was widely known among longtime members of the community, who often warned newcomers to steer clear of him. This negative reputation followed him closely, and Bruce became known as a man with a taste for violent fetishes. In one notable episode, he was even thrown out of a coffee shop when he told one of his friends what had happened. The friend chose to cut ties with him entirely, swayed by warnings from others who'd shared unsettling stories about Bruce. Bruce reacted with anger, lashing out at the friend and accusing him of being just like everyone else who thought he was crazy. Despite his turbulent personal life, his professional reputation rested on a solid base of wealthy, older clients who found him elegant, charming, and reliable. Bruce ran his landscaping company, Artistic Designs, and was frequently seen working alongside at least one laborer responsible for the heavier physical work. According to witnesses, this laborer was typically of South or Southeast Asian or Middle Eastern descent. Overall, Bruce cut a fairly well-known figure in his community. He even played Santa Claus at the Eaton Center Mall and regularly donated flowers to local charities, cultivating a public image that appeared thoroughly respectable. By mid-2014, Bruce's son Todd was arrested again, this time for another obscene phone call case. Bruce paid his bail, and Todd moved in with him, helping out with the landscaping business. But Todd struggled deeply with his father's homosexuality, and living together only grew harder once he had to face the bathroom wall in Bruce's home, decorated with images of nude South Asian men. During questioning, Bruce stayed silent about the number of victims, refusing to give investigators any concrete information. While he remained in custody, a series of search warrants were issued for properties tied to people connected to Bruce, including sites where he'd done landscaping work. One of these properties belonged to an old friend, Roger Horn. Another belonged to Bruce's ex-boyfriend, but neither search turned up any evidence. By contrast, at a property on Mallory Crescent, in Toronto's Leaside neighborhood, police cadaver dogs showed strong interest. A detailed forensic search followed, extending into the ravines near the property. During the search, teams uncovered large planter boxes, all frozen solid due to the winter weather. After thawing them out, investigators discovered the dismembered remains of at least 3 people. In total, there were 12 planter boxes, with human remains found in 2 of them. The evidence collected led to the identification of the victims. Majid Kayhan, missing since 2012, Soroush Mahmoudi, missing since 2015, and Dean Lisowick, a homeless man who had never been formally reported missing and hadn't been part of the task force's original list. Based on these findings, Bruce MacArthur was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Sometime later, additional remains were discovered and identified as belonging to Andrew Kinsman. Excavations on the Mallory Crescent property proved challenging, and other planter boxes were collected from different residences, though none of them yielded any additional remains. Ontario's chief forensic pathologist, Michael Pollinen, led the analysis and identification of the remains, noting that despite his team's vast experience, this investigation was extraordinarily complex, made harder still by advanced decomposition and the fact that MacArthur had dismembered his victims. Between late January and early February 2018, a command post was set up at the Leaside property to centralize the search. Excavations and investigations at the site continued for 3 weeks, closely followed by Toronto's press throughout. Bruce MacArthur's name had, by then, become synonymous with terror. Everyone in the city was talking about its serial killer. Detective Hank Idsinga oversaw numerous searches of Bruce's apartment, which he believed served as the actual scene of the murders. Over 4 months, more than 18,000 photographs were analyzed, and over 1,800 items were collected as evidence. Then, on February 23, 2018, Bruce was formally charged with the first-degree murder of Skandaraj Navaratnam, one of the men originally investigated under Project Houston. Skandaraj had been missing since 2010, and his remains were found alongside those of the other victims, his identity confirmed through dental records. The following month, authorities received more than 500 tips related to possibly identifying other missing men who might have fallen victim to Bruce MacArthur. During this same period, another set of remains was recovered from the planter boxes, identified as belonging to Abdul Basir Faizi, missing since 2010. With these additional discoveries, Bruce MacArthur was formally charged with the deaths of every man investigated under both Project Houston and Project Prism. Shortly after, the remains of Kirosnakumar Kanagaratnam, missing since 2015, were also recovered from the Leaside property. According to the task force, identifying Kirosnakumar was only possible after contact with an international agency. He'd been under a deportation order and had never been formally reported missing. When the searches finally concluded, the task force had recovered the remains of every listed victim, a mark of thorough, careful work. It became clear the Leaside property had served as Bruce MacArthur's primary burial ground. Though other planter boxes were examined at various locations, no additional victims were ever found. Eventually, Bruce MacArthur was formally charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. With the searches and investigation drawing to a close, the task force set out to build a comprehensive timeline of every crime Bruce had committed. During this review, investigators considered the possibility that he might be tied to other, still unconnected disappearances, a suspicion that launched an entirely new investigation, this time focused on identifying possible additional victims. After Bruce MacArthur's arrest, the task force showed strong interest in revisiting cold homicide cases, hoping to find connections to the killer. Representatives from foreign countries also reached out, raising the possibility that Bruce might be linked to deaths that occurred abroad during trips he'd taken overseas. The investigation revealed just how calculating Bruce had been in choosing his victims, targeting the most vulnerable. He avoided areas with security cameras and rarely used cell phones, preferring payphones to contact his targets. Online, he operated under a range of pseudonyms, keeping his real identity hidden from most people he interacted with. Detective Sergeant Stacy Gallant of the Cold Case Unit led a review of at least 600 archived cases, comparing them against Bruce's known patterns of behavior. That effort surfaced at least 15 unsolved homicide cases connected to Toronto's gay village. Notably, these cases dated back to between 1975 and 1978, a period when Bruce was in his early 20s and working in areas near where the crimes occurred. According to the records, the victims in these cases were all older men, found in their own homes, undressed, bound, and killed by stabbing or severe beating. The level of violence far exceeded what the crimes required, suggesting these killings were motivated by hate, a pattern also observed in Bruce's confirmed murders. Efforts to connect these cold cases to Bruce continued through the end of 2018. During that time, roughly 100 residences were searched on suspicion they may have been used to bury victims, but no new evidence ever surfaced. Without additional proof, investigators were never able to formally tie Bruce McArthur to any case beyond the 8 already confirmed. Even so, other jurisdictions continued expressing interest in possible connections to Bruce, keeping the case open on multiple fronts. One notable example of this ongoing interest came from the Waterloo Regional Police, who wanted to question the serial killer about the disappearance of 30-year-old David McDade, missing since 2002. David had been reported missing after failing to show up for a planned meeting with friends. The circumstances surrounding his disappearance bore striking similarities to the cases Bruce had already been investigated for and charged with. Another name of interest was John Riley, 48, who moved to Toronto in 2013 to work in landscaping but was never seen again. According to the investigation, after arriving in the city, John lived in the gay village area and sought out local shelters before mysteriously disappearing. Despite significant efforts to solve hundreds of cold cases bearing similarities to Bruce's profile, investigators were never able to formally connect him to these disappearances. Meanwhile, the remains of all of Bruce McArthur's confirmed victims stayed in the custody of coroners and forensic pathologists who conducted extensive analysis to gather information useful for trial. Once the forensic work concluded, the remains were released to the victims' families, allowing them to hold funerals. As families prepared to honor their loved ones, the prosecution worked tirelessly to build an airtight case against Bruce McArthur, seeking final justice for every man whose life had been brutally cut short. Bruce McArthur's first court appearance came in January 2018, where he was represented by his lawyer, Marion Radley Solly. He made several subsequent court appearances, including one held online via video conference. Later proceedings, however, were conducted under a publication ban, restricting release of court information related to the case. It wasn't until June 2018 that Bruce's defense team gained full access to the case files, which totaled more than 10,000 pages, along with the physical evidence collected. Daniel Brown, an additional lawyer brought onto the defense team, argued the trial would be slow and complex for a jury. He requested the charges be separated, proposing each homicide be tried independently. During this same period, the press requested public access to Bruce McArthur's psychiatric reports. Justice John McMahon granted the request, allowing the reports to be released and giving media access to autopsy photos of the victims and the weapon used in the crimes, though publication of the images themselves was prohibited. Defense lawyers argued this release could harm Bruce, but the judge concluded the psychiatric reports could, in some ways, help the public better understand the case. In October 2018, Bruce appeared in court once more and waived his right to a preliminary hearing, choosing not to contest the evidence presented. He was then formally indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder. In January 2019, Bruce McArthur pleaded guilty to all charges, avoiding a lengthy trial. During the hearing, the details of the murders were described as premeditated and sexual in nature. It was revealed that Bruce kept trophies from his victims, jewelry, a notebook, and numerous post-mortem photographs. The photos depicted the victims' bodies in specific poses, often with cords around their necks or undressed and dressed in fur coats or random hats. Notably, in some cases, the victims had their hair and beards shaved. The items Bruce kept as trophies were later found in a shed. The combination of evidence and his own guilty plea ensured Bruce McArthur was held fully accountable for the brutal crimes that had shaken Toronto. Ultimately, Bruce McArthur was found to have deliberately exploited his victims' vulnerabilities, which made their disappearances nearly invisible to authorities. For each murder, Bruce used sex as a means of luring his victims, then killed them by ligature strangulation. In February 2019, the presiding judge announced his intention to impose a period of parole ineligibility of at least 50 years, citing Bruce's complete lack of remorse and the deep harm he'd caused the community. In the end, though, the final sentence handed down was life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years, half the period originally proposed. Bruce's crimes were described as pure evil, with the court noting that had he not been stopped, he almost certainly would have continued killing. Following the conviction, sharp criticism emerged. LGBT activists in Toronto argued authorities could have acted much sooner, but only moved forward with an arrest once a white man, Andrew Kinsman, went missing. The task force denied these accusations, stating that Projects Houston and PRISM had always been broad, thorough investigations. They also stressed that Andrew Kinsman's case had proven crucial in identifying Bruce because of the specific evidence his disappearance provided, not because of his race. CBC News published a report examining pages of judicial warrants and concluded the task force had consistently worked to solve the cases of every missing man, regardless of background. Police Chief Mark Saunders echoed this, stating that after Bruce's arrest, several men came forward with their own stories involving the killer. Saunders argued that if these accounts had surfaced sooner, Bruce might have been caught earlier. These comments, however, sparked a strong backlash from the LGBTQ+ community, who interpreted Saunders' remarks as an attempt to blame the victims. Facing mounting pressure, Saunders publicly apologized and received support from then-Mayor John Tory. Among the stories that gained attention during this phase of the case, one in particular stood out. In mid-2016, Bruce met a man through a BDSM dating app, and the two arranged to meet for sex in his van, parked outside a McDonald's. During the encounter, Bruce attempted to strangle the man, who managed to fight back and escape. Shaken, he went straight to police and reported the incident. This account added yet another dark chapter to Bruce McArthur's history. But at the time, unfortunately, it led to no action that could have stopped him. Bruce was arrested in 2016, following the attempted strangulation in the parking lot. But he claimed the victim had consented to the act and, at some point, panicked, unfairly accusing him. His account gained credibility when the man confirmed he'd known Bruce for some time and that it wasn't the first time they'd been together, on top of having met through a BDSM app. Given these circumstances, police found the story plausible and decided not to file charges, releasing Bruce without further action. Critics later pointed to this episode as a serious failure on the part of authorities. Still, in the absence of concrete evidence implicating Bruce as the aggressor, there was little more they could have done at the time. This incident, along with other similar accounts, illustrated how Bruce McArthur managed to operate for years as a serial sexual predator in the gay village, repeatedly slipping through the cracks of accountability. For investigators and writers alike, these accounts raise suspicion that Bruce could be connected to other unsolved homicides. After all, Bruce McArthur led a double life for a very long time. Outside the gay village, he was an apparently gentle gardener, admired by his elderly clients across Toronto. Within the gay community, however, he was known as a man in search of violent sex, with many people not even knowing his real name. While it's plausible he committed other murders elsewhere, that remains speculation. What's certain is that Bruce McArthur stands as the most prolific serial killer ever identified in Toronto. Today, in his 70s, Bruce won't be eligible to apply for parole until age 91. given the severity of his crimes and his declining health, though. It's highly unlikely he'll ever be released. Authorities expect he will die naturally behind bars. Finally, this story didn't only bring justice to Bruce's victims. The case of Tess Richardson, the 22-year-old found dead during the investigation into Toronto's missing men, was also resolved. Thanks to the investigation, the man captured in the security footage was identified as Kalen Schlatter, 21 years old. With no prior criminal record, Kalen was charged with first-degree murder. In 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years for Tess's murder. Despite this, the case of Alaura Wells, the 27-year-old transgender woman found dead during the investigation, remains unsolved, though there's still hope that one day it will be.